we have Oregon taking on Indiana in the second of the two semifinal games for another shot at a national championship spot for these teams in the Peach Bowl. And a fun fact about these two teams, Indiana, this is one of the greatest turnarounds we've probably seen in sports history because until recently, Indiana was the losingest team all time in college football history since it began, which is absolutely insane. And these last 2 years under head coach Curt Cignetti have completely revolutionized the program to 11-plus wins in each of the last two seasons, and they are seeking their first ever national championship, but so is Oregon. I did not realize that Oregon had never, ever won. I know they had made it to the national championship before when they had Heisman quarterback Marcus Mariota, but they ended up losing that game. But for Indiana, they are coming off of a really dominant playoff run, albeit they did have a bye, but once they faced Alabama in that second round, I mean, it was not even close. They pretty much steamrolled them the entire way, 38-3, and that pretty much put a lot of people, like it got them to pay attention to this team a little bit because I know a lot of people like to write off Indiana because they were undefeated, that they didn't play anybody, and the Big Ten, you know, a lot of people like to think that SEC is more dominant, which it's kind of flailing a little bit if you look at the track record with the SEC, because I saw a stat this morning actually that this is actually the third year in a row that an SEC team will not make an appearance in the national title game. And that's the first time this has happened since about, I want to say like 2003. So it has been over 20 years since something like this happened. So that dominance might be slipping a little bit in this case. But for Indiana, like I said, they plowed over Alabama. And then Oregon, their first matchup against James Madison was a lot closer than people would have liked, I guess. If you're looking at the outcome, I think Oregon dominated the entire way. They won 51-34, but that 34 is where people kind of have some questions or kind of scratch their head a little bit because you gave up 34 points to James Madison, but then they kind of quieted all of that in their next round matchup against Big 12 champion Texas Tech, where they completely shut them down 23-0. Albeit Texas Tech's defense was probably the best in the nation. That's why they didn't score more. But the fact that Oregon's defense stepped up and pitched a shutout was nothing short of remarkable for them. Their defense has really come into form, which is why I'm kind of worried if I'm Indiana in this one. I do think that Indiana is the best team in the country, but this Oregon defense, man, that scares me a little bit. This is actually a rematch between these two teams with Indiana and Oregon playing earlier in the regular season. That was very, very closely contested. It was tied midway through the fourth quarter, 20-20, before Indiana scored 10 straight points and went on to win 30-20 in that one. And they also, in that game, Heisman winner of this year, quarterback Fernando Mendoza, he was pretty solid in that one. He threw for 215 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception, while Dante Moore of Oregon, their quarterback, probably had one of his worst games of the season. Oregon as a whole, that was probably their worst game of the season, and I don't expect the same performance here. But like I said, Dante Moore, he only threw for 186 passing yards, 1 touchdown, and 2 interceptions, and was sacked 6 times in that game. That was by far their worst game of the season, like I said, and I think they are ready with a vengeance here to make it a little bit closer in this one. This is another game where Indiana is favored by 3.5 points. Again, it's a really tricky number here because you have to win by 2 scores. But Oregon's defense has been playing a lot better throughout the season. They rank 5th in yards per play allowed and 3rd in passing yards per play allowed. So it's going to be really, really tough for Indiana if they kind of force Indiana to beat them through the air. I think it could. I mean, they had the Heisman winner, like I said, so it's not out of the question, but they're really going to have to hone in on their defense to help them have a chance in this game and at least keep it close throughout the game. And hopefully their offense could do enough for them to win this game. Again, I think that Indiana's the best team in the country. I think I would side with them to win. Not sure about the 3.5, though, because I think this would be a game where, again, it comes down to the final possession, much like last night's game. So I think if Indiana wins on a field goal, I would not be surprised in the slightest. But that 3.5 number, it's a little bit tricky for me.